Here's a man who has seen the internet from every angle. As a lawyer, as a lobbyist, as a Google executive, as a Mozilla fellow, as an entrepreneur. And what did 30 years at the center of power teach him? That the web needs to be rewoven from the ground up, with trust built in. GliaNet, the Glia Foundation, Net Fiduciaries. A book that landed in 2024 like a quiet manifesto for the internet we deserve. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Whitt.
Hey folks, great to be here. Thank you. We've already heard some amazing conversation this afternoon about decentralized technologies from Rafi, just from Drummond, before that Ben. And I'm here to tell you that's amazing work, but there's one missing layer. And I'm hoping to convince you in the next few minutes what that layer is, and more importantly, how we can get there. It's the fiduciary governance infrastructure, as I call it. So I did spend about 12 years at Google, started in the public policy team in DC. When I left in 2018, I was dissatisfied with the direction the company was taking, but not just Google, right? All of their brethren in the big tech world. I went to the Mozilla Foundation for 3.5 years as a fellow, and I developed this thing called GliaNet. So Glia is the ancient Greek word for glue, and I chose it for 3 reasons. One is this idea that trust is the social glue that binds us together as individuals, as communities, as marketplaces, as political systems. That trust, obviously, over many years has been eroding away for many reasons. As I say, the web didn't start it, but it certainly has helped exacerbate it. So how do we create greater trust in the systems that we are embedded in every day? Second is the credo from Spider-Man, one of my favorite Marvel heroes. With great power comes great responsibility. And in the web today, and now we're seeing it in the big AI context as well, that trust, the notion that sort of joining of power and responsibility has come asunder. So we now have enormous amounts of power, more or less unhindered, not just by laws and regulations, but even basic senses of ethics and duty and decency. And the third is the glial network in the brain. So in the late 19th century, when they first did graphs of the brain, they could see the neural networks. They were moving very quickly, the electrical charges going back and forth. They saw this stuff in the middle, which they thought was inert matter, didn't do anything. They said, well, this must be the stuff that glues the neurons together. As it turns out, these were the glial cells, glial networks. They operated on chemicals, not electrical signals. And because of that, people couldn't actually see it in the graphs. We've now come to realize in the last several decades in particular from the neuroscience world that glial networks do an enormous amount of work to protect, promote, and enhance the operation of the neural networks. So I live in Silicon Valley, been there for 11 years now. I like to say you see neural networks everywhere when you go to dinner parties and have conversations. Not a whole lot of glial networks, right? The basic support systems that every human being should have as part of their interactions on the web. So this was part of my guiding thinking around why we needed something different. Turned into a book, came out about 1.5 years ago called Reweaving the Web. And now this GliaNet Alliance that I started, which is 25 member companies, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So this is an alliance, a nonprofit wrapped around for-profit, mostly smaller seed companies who want to essentially do the right thing, but also be commercially successful. So it goes both ways in terms of ethical elements that are embedded into business models. In the book, I talk about the prevailing economic of the web, the paradigm, which is what I call SEAMS. A lot of this comes from Shoshana Zuboff in her Surveillance Capitalism book, but well documented. We know what this all talks about in terms of surveillance, extraction, analysis, and now manipulation increasingly coming at us from the AI algorithms that are much more advanced than they were just a couple of years ago. So I talk about this different paradigm, what I call HACS, human autonomy and agency via computational systems, and that we need to figure out how to take the technology and the governance and put them together in ways that put people in control. What I see here is what I'm calling the edge-based gap in AI governance. So we have sort of the supply side saturation coming at us from what was the big tech companies, increasingly big AI companies, and that governance field is dominated by notions of trust, of safety, right, of safeguards, of transparency, of accountability. It's essentially, as I say, how do you make the big guys hurt me less today than they did yesterday, and maybe hurt me a bit less tomorrow than they do today? It's hugely important work, but it is incomplete because it's focused on just one side of the platform. Another way to think about it here is the AI governance landscape. So if you look at the technology layer at the bottom, governance layer at the top, the platforms are occupying the left side, what I call the edge side, basically all of us, or on the right side. So the platform technology, no great surprise, the big names are down there at the bottom. At the top, as I mentioned, it's the fights over things like the EU AI Act and maybe some of the EU or the AI acts that are being developed now in a few of the states in the US. It's trust and safety teams that are formed with great applause and then quietly disbanded, right? These are the efforts to attempt to constrain the technology companies in the lower left quadrant. Then you shift over to the right side. Again, amazing technologies being built with all of you today, the technologists around the DWeb notions. Drummond just talked about the idea of the verifiable trust communities. Incredible stuff, right? Over and over, we're seeing open source communities developing the right thing. And yet, my concern here is what I call the Zuckerberg principle. If any of these technologies can be taken and bolted to the side of Meta, tomorrow, it's no longer a piece of decentralized tech that empowers people. It's just a part of the big Meta superstructure that abides by the singular notion of surveillance, extraction, analysis, manipulation. So we are creating the tools that we would love to believe are in fact going to change the world, and I do fervently believe they can. But the thing that we're missing is what I consider the upper right corner, which is the governance. We need, in addition to the technology, we need a governance regime that ensures that technology is being deployed and developed and utilized in the right way. And so I think of that as what I call a nascent area that we haven't talked about enough. And my humble suggestion is what I'm doing at GliaNet. Others are doing it too, but I believe this is a pretty unique opportunity to work together on building out what I call the fiduciary governance infrastructure. So what is this exactly? Well, as a lawyer, and I apologize in advance to many of you here in the room, I went back in 2018 and 2019 times frame when I was at Mozilla, trying to figure out what are the ways in the past that we have looked to different principles, laws, paradigms to constrain power. And over again, it coming from the common law, the answer was fiduciary principles. When you think about the early days of the medical profession, legal profession, certain financial advisor roles, real estate brokers, right? Like time and again, this notion has been when there's an asymmetry of power between one entity or group of entities and individuals, society has determined that fiduciary common law principles of care and loyalty should apply. And there are professions built around that, codes of conduct, enforceable paradigms that show up, whether it's at the country level or in the United States, increasingly the state level. That has been the way that we have thought about it. And so my summation was, you know what? In the world of data and then the coming world of AI agents, we lack anything like that. In some sense, it's the missing profession of the 21st century. And so my conclusion from that was, I don't see it anywhere. I'm going to try to build it myself. So that became the basis of building out this idea of the GliaNet project, turned into the book, turned into the Alliance. Right now, we have some basic elements we're trying to develop here on the right side there, including some pilots. We've got trustworthy certification and licensing regime we're developing with a number of our member companies, including Consumer Reports. Quai is one of our member organizations. So pleased that you all are here with us to take us on this journey. And the notion is our year one success here, execution mode, is to create actual infrastructure in the world. And then while we call it infrastructure very deliberately, and we saw this unfortunately last week with our friends at Anthropic. So as I noted there on LinkedIn, I did a short video where I explained the challenge of trying to create governance from the top down. In this case, it's a CEO who has a very strong ethical standard around how his technology is being utilized. The problem and challenge that he has is basically him and the way he thinks, the way he looks at the world. It's basically, it's a principle, it's a paragraph, it is a unilateral statement of where he stands The issue there, of course, is that in this case, the US government could put enormous pressure on him politically and economically to change his stance. And we've seen that over and over in other places. When I was at Google, we had the don't be evil standard that quietly went away one day. Nobody talked about it. It just simply evaporated. OpenAI has gone through numerous, numerous evolutions, if you want to call it that, to get away from their original being safe around building for nonprofit purposes mode. Anthropic is facing the same problem. So we have to think of governance not something you put at the top at the very end, has to be embedded at the core, has to go along for the ride in every step of creating and launching a product. Starts at the policy level, but also then in the internal practices, the business model, protocols and standards, all of the elements that make it what it is something that, again, under the Zuckerberg principle, you bolt it to the side of Meta, that thing ain't changing, at least without enormous effort, enormous time, and also the transparency around it is something that people will be able to recognize, understand, and hopefully respond to. So that's the difference between governance as policy and governance as actually embedded into the DNA of an entity. So here's one way to think about it. I worked at Google, as I said. I've known Vint Cerf for many years. He taught me to think about the world as a series of layers. This is my fumbling attempt to sort of treat this a bit like the IP layer in the internet protocol in the internet. Something that sits in the middle. It binds together all the different kinds of devices, interfaces, content at the top, as well as the different kinds of organizations, networks, and infrastructures at the bottom. It's intended to be lightweight enough to apply in these different contexts, but effective enough that it actually can be abiding. So that's at least the intention of treating it this way. I do have to pause. I'm taking the spot that Doc Searles was intended to take today. He was double booked, unfortunately. So shout out to Doc. As many of you know, he's much taller and better looking than I am, but nonetheless, I'll do my best to do the 2 minutes that Doc would have done if he was here. He's been working for many years on the so-called My Term standard, IEEE 7012. Finally came out in January. They're moving down the road in terms of trying to get much bigger market adoption. Doc would say that we should be the principal, not the product, right? Digital systems are supposed to serve our interests and rights. He has talked about this notion of intent casting, myself into the web. He wrote a whole book about it, The Intention Economy, about 12 years ago now, I believe. And we should all have self-determination in our digital life. What he has now helped produce with lots of other talented and dedicated folks is this IEEE 7012 standard, essentially the ability to project my terms into the web rather than the other way around, using the web browser the way some people think it should have been always. My sort of instrument into utilizing websites, accessing information, content for my benefit, and again, quote, on my terms. So that's my Doc Searles advertisement. A couple of last things here, and then I'm happy to take some questions. One of the reasons we believe that trust is in fact important is looking at some of the economic literature, looking at examples from the marketplace. Authentic trust, if it's something that is, again, embedded into the core of an entity and well understood by the audience of customers or patrons it's serving, actually can build successful relationships. And the point here, again, it's not just for commercial, for-profit uses. We're trying to prove that as the hard case, but nonprofits can take it on, civic institutions can take it on. And so in the world of AI agents in particular, this kind of trust dynamic, we don't see any of that today. In fact, we see much of the reverse of that in situations like OpenClaw, et cetera. Zero privacy, zero security, zero sense of any kind of trust. And of course, many of those, unfortunately, those agents are able to take advantage of people who don't understand that at a deep level. The trust feedback loop as a market differentiator, as I mentioned, there's some initial research we're doing as an alliance, more on the way. One of the things we're finding, if you look again at different market segments where the notion of trust that is, for example, used in certifications or trust marks, where the brand is identified in a certain way with a certain category, people will respond favorably. Consumers will spend something like 3 to 4 times more money in that situation on that particular approach, that kind of a branding around trust, than they would in a situation where it's not visible. So we believe that's the kind of thing we need to build on and make apparent to folks in the marketplace. The PEP model is the basis of this. This comes from the common law as applied to the web. Duty of care, duty of fidelity, duty of loyalty. Don't have time to go into much detail now. It's in my book on Amazon, my favorite monopolist provider. Hardback, paperback, ebook, audiobook. I'll have a few copies tonight also at the reception afterwards. But the idea is you're taking these basic elements of common law, putting it into the infrastructure of your organization, and then you're applying it in various ways on the web. Why become a certified net fiduciary? There's many advantages. Again, come talk to me afterwards. This is what we're building at the GliaNet Alliance. We have 25 members. We have more coming on the way just in the last year since we've gotten ourselves going. Would love to talk to you if you have any interest in working with us. The flexibility of the role also, as I mentioned, it's not just on the commercial side, although most of our companies are for-profits. It also works very well in civic institutions, nonprofits. The notion of being a fiduciary really can span any and all of these kinds of sector approaches. The certification pathway that we're building, we're starting with a pledge mark. We're moving forward from there into a more sort of enforceable approach with actual recourse, real teeth behind it. That's sort of the evolutionary steps that we're taking in the next year. And then we have a pledge program, as it is mentioned, where a number of the companies, including Quai, have stepped up early. Number 2 on our list, the second of our pledged providers. Basically, you agree to take on as a voluntary standard to be a fiduciary. We give you the pledge mark. You can use that on your website or your materials. And then we come back and sort of ensure that things are going well. If, of course, things don't go well, unfortunately, the ultimate recourse is we pull the brand, pull the pledge mark, which is not a great thing for anybody, but it is an attempt, at least initially, to create some sort of enforceable teeth in the process. So thank you all for your time today. If we have any time for questions, happy to take them, and good afternoon.
Okay. Any questions? Over there. Hang on.
Hey,
No,
Matt.
no. I get to play Jerry Springer. Come on.
Okay, it's Matt. It must be a ringer question.
Oh boy, how within this trust framework, how are you measuring it? You know, kind of similar question to the last question. Where's the curation happen? How are you kind of evolving this to understand who is going to be keeping up with the pledge? And especially when so many of us are building on other third-party providers, do they need to be part of the pledge in order to bring it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So part of this is, I should have mentioned at the outset, we consider ourselves an open source community. So we're building a very detailed guidebook around all of this, from the economics to the technology to the way you implement it as a sort of governance structures in an organization. We're going to publish that for anybody to take a look at, kick the tires on. We treat this as an iterative process. One thing that has come up, as you point out, I think quite rightly, is, great, I can trust you as an entity initially with a direct relationship as a customer or patron. What about you then off to somebody else, you know, at a B2B to C relationship or B2B to B2B, you know, endless sort of chains. That's a challenge. One of the things we're pushing for as a public policy point of view is to say, look, trust is something in terms of fidelity and loyalty you cannot mandate, right? Forcing Zuckerberg to say, I'm going to be a fiduciary for you, I believe is a big mistake, because then it becomes a compliance regime. Then he does the minimum necessary to skirt by, pay enormous fines, whatever. That's not the way we want to do it. We want there to be actual voluntarily opting into this approach because they see it as a market differentiator. When you move on past that, one of the things worth believing might be necessary is to create a mandatory duty of care. The very basic do not harm me standard, protect me standard, require that anytime somebody has my data and or an algorithm is making consequential decisions about my life. In either context, I should have the right to expect that at minimum, you're going to protect my interests in those situations.
Okay. Richard, thank you very much.